In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Earlier this week, the following story came across my Facebook feed. You may have seen it at some point in the past as well. Story. Years ago, anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. The student expected Mead to talk about fishhooks or clay pots or grinding stones. But no, Mead said that the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur, a thigh bone, that had been broken and then healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You cannot run from danger, get to the river for a drink, or hunt for food. You are meat for prowling beasts. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. A broken femur that has been healed is evidence that someone has taken time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts, Mead said. We are at our best when we serve others. Be civilized. By the way, there are multiple references to this story. Just do a search on Mead and femur. I read the story and nodded my head. Wow, that's cool. But when I see something like this come across social media, especially if I think it might be useful in a sermon, I want to ensure I get the proper original source, even though we know everything on Facebook is true. So I did a little background checking. There's a problem. Even though the story was quoted in many places, including Forbes magazine, there is no clear evidence that she ever had this conversation. The story has been around for quite some time, but there is no direct citation to Mead, even when the account first appeared in a 1980s book entitled Fearfully and Wonderfully Made by Christian authors Paul Brand and Philip Yancey. It recently reappeared with vigor during the pandemic. By the way, it's also not true that only humans tend to their broken or ill kin. There's enough evidence in the non-human animal kingdom to argue that chimps, elephants, or wolves are civilized. All that hard evidence aside about its factual basis, it is a cool story. It's a story that, as I mentioned, reemerged during the initial months of the pandemic. Why? Well, I can't authoritatively say I wasn't the one who retold the story, but I can imagine that it was recounted perhaps to encourage us to take care of those who are suffering from COVID, and maybe to encourage us to wear masks, as signs that we were civilized. Again, I don't know precisely why that Margaret Mead story was told and then retold in business journals as well as the internet. But I can't imagine that it is heard in much the same way as I heard it this week. That's a great story about how we are meant to behave as civilized, ethical people. It's a story devoid of politics that appeals to our better natures, to what we want to believe about ourselves, about who we are called to be as humans living in a community. It is a good secular story. It tells the same, emphasizes the same truth that we as Christians love to hear and need to demonstrate. Think Good Samaritan. It is, at its core, the same story that we heard this morning in our readings from 2 Kings about Elisha and Luke about Jesus. Most of the stories about Elisha with different particulars, of course, contain similar themes. Often what we see are actions that save Elisha's marginalized followers from material distress. We read that he purifies a vital spring, making water palatable for Jericho's residents. He increases a widow's supply of oil so that she won't lose her children to a creditor. He promises a son to a Shunammite woman, and then when that son dies, he revives him and restores him to his mother. He neutralizes a poison in a stew so that his disciples can eat during a famine. He multiplies 20 loaves of bread in order to feed 100 people. And as we heard today, he heals the Syrian general Naaman of a skin disease. Aside from these miracles, Elisha was considered a prophet. He inherited that role, that mantle, from Elijah, another prophet. And a number of other stories about him show him continuing Elijah's commission in being engaged in the affairs and the politics of the day. We don't see, however, in the accounts of Elisha any predictions about what is going to happen in the future. We hardly see any critiques of the current situation. Both of those characteristics of a prophet we have come to expect. No, we see a prophet who simply acted on behalf of God. Elisha, like any prophet, was an agent transmitting God's will. In the story we heard this morning in particular, we witness a great extension of Elisha's transmission of God's will beyond the immediate cares of God's own people. Naaman, a Syrian general, suffered from some kind of skin disease. It was a serious matter. He could have been seen as polluting those around him. He sought to be cured. An Israelite slave girl referred him to Elisha, an Israelite, man of God. Through his interaction with Elisha, he was made clean. Not only was Naaman physically cured or made whole, his relationship was restored with his community, secular and religious. We read a few verses later that Naaman expects to be allowed back into the temple of the Syrian god Rimmon. Elisha, the Israelite prophet, an agent of the transmission of God's will, demonstrates that God's will for the healing of an individual, as well as the healing of relationships, wasn't confined to a special people. Likewise, Jesus' actions with the 10 lepers, as they're often called, demonstrate the same quality or character of a prophet as an agent of the transmission of God's will for individual and communal wholeness. While the precise geography of the story is a bit hazy, Luke, the only evangelist who tells this story, clearly places the encounter in a location where Jews and Samaritans were in close proximity. While, as with Naaman, we doubt that the men suffered from Hansen's disease, we can tell that their condition was one that exiled them from their homes. Jesus apparently didn't care where the men originated. He promised all of them that they would be healed. God's desire for wholeness is universal. And he told them to, quote, show themselves to the priests, that is, do what was necessary to be restored to their individual communities. The promised healing was twofold: individual health as well as communal health. What's a bit different in this story, and perfectly in line with Luke's overall emphasis on the availability of Jesus' message to non-Jews, is how the Samaritan fits in. Yes, at a junction point between Samaria and Galilee, Jewish and Samaritan lepers would have created a common community. But with their cure, the Jewish lepers, once they were showed themselves to the priests, would have been cured and allowed to rejoin their original community. The Samaritan would not have needed the Jewish priests. So while he may have been restored to his Samaritan home, his prostration at Jesus' feet, especially as Luke tells the story, suggests that he has found a more profound priest as well, and a new, radically inclusive community the Jesus way. Elisha and Jesus, both as prophets, in their own ways and contexts, communicated God's will, wholeness for individuals and wholeness within communities. The stories about Elisha were centuries old before being recorded and are subject to elaboration and editorial comment. We weren't there. The account of Jesus and the 10 lepers, told only by Luke, may or may not have happened exactly as recorded. We don't know. In that regard, both stories bear similar levels of factual uncertainty, as does the Margaret Mead femur civilization story. But I would argue they all, religious and secular stories, tell the capital T truth. God wishes us to be whole individuals. That is the root meaning of salvation, after all. God's will for us is to be healed, and by extension to be prophets, agents of the transmission of God's will for healing to others, and to create healthy, life-giving, and sustaining communities. And so the significant question to us is, how, as constantly being healed individuals, as members of a constantly being healed community, can we extend God's ministry in a world of lepers seeking wholeness and welcome?